Alrighty then. Alrighty. I'm going to hold this up so that you guys can see it. I don't know how that's going to come out. It needs to be further back and it's too big. I don't know. I'll probably take a picture of it and then I'll drop it in and edit it in. Alright, so I'm going to probably be out of frame on a lot of this so that you can understand what it is that I'm doing. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble with this, but that's the way it is, okay? So this video is about why it is that cryptocurrencies are a really bad idea, right? Really, really bad idea. Let's put this over here. Where cryptocurrencies, shotgun mic. Cryptocurrencies are a really bad idea. I'm going to go through the basics here, and then I'll do a, I'll cut out because I'll have to clean this board, and I'll be able to draw on it later on. All right. So let's start off with just this part over here. All right, the part in the center. Right. I don't know if you can see these numbers or not, but these represent and are for this equation down at the bottom. Y squared equals x cubed plus x plus 7 mod 13. Now I'll explain modulo mathematics to those of you who don't understand it. It's called clock face mechanics, and I'll do that in the second half of this video. All right? So when you do the math, these xy coordinates 1, 3, 1, 10, 2, 2, 2, 11, 4, 6, 4, 7, 9, 2, 9, 11, 10, 4, 10, 9, 11, 6, and 11, 7, these points that are on this, these points that are here, all right, there's your x-axis, here's your y-axis. Not everybody has a lot of math, so I'm trying to keep this simple. Are solutions to this equation, okay? And what you do is for example, you could take the point 11,7, and you done 11,7. So now, of course, now the y position is y squared. So that's 49 equals x cubed. Well, x is 11. Okay, you can't see down here. All right, so there we go. Let's see if we can do. Still can't see it. All right, so what you do is you have. This is the y. This is the x. 11 is the x. 7 is the y. Right. So what you're doing is you're substituting 7 into y squared. So that's 49. And then you've got 11 cubed, because that's the x. That's 11 cubed is 113, well, 1,331, plus 11, because 11 is x, plus 7 is 1349, okay? Now, how do you know the point is on the curve? Well, you take that 1349, you subtract 49 from it, which is 1300, and then you do what's called a modulo operator on it, and it should equal 0. If it does equal 0, then you know that this is in fact a solution to this number. Okay, so this gives you the points, the actual discrete points on what's called an elliptic curve. And like I said in the second part, I'll explain what that means. Now, why does this matter? Because to solve the blockchain, what the Bitcoin algorithm does is it uses something called SHA-256. Now, SHA-256 is a hashing algorithm. Now, what a hashing algorithm is it takes a document, a movie, any amount of information and reduces it, in this example, to a 256-bit ones and zeros, 256 ones and zeros, representing a 32-byte number sequence in hexadecimal. All right, so that's a lot of ones and zeros. 256 ones and zeros. It's 255, but keep it simple. It's 256. All right. So what they do is they take all the information, and once again, I'm keeping this simple. They take all of the information. Take all of the information that's in that block, right, the blockchain, and they run a hash on it, right, and it turns it into this number. Well, if the number doesn't start currently, this is the current algorithms, it's how difficult, it's a difficulty setting. how many zeros have to be at the beginning of that 256-bit number. Currently, unless it's bigger than what I just looked up, is as of 2021, and it could be very well be more than this, 19 zeros. So if it doesn't start with 19 zeros, they use what's called a nonce, and it's just an incrementer. Nonce stands for number used once. Nonce, all right? It uses a nonce. Uses a nonce, right? And they increment that nonce one digit. And then they add it to the information that's in the block, and then they run the hash against it again. All right, and if it doesn't start with 19 zeros, they increment it again and increment it again. And they do this trillions and trillions of times to be able to solve that problem. This is called proof of work. And this deliberately slows down the transactions so that somebody who's a nefarious state actor, like let's say China or Russia, they don't have enough processing power and electricity to be able to sit down and actually fork the blockchain and be able to steal money. All right, I mean, it's more complicated than that, but it's a basic idea of what's going on. All right. Well, the problem and the reason why Bitcoin and any other these cryptocurrencies based on this idea of the blockchain will never work is that currently, right? Where's the number? There are 234,598 transactions per day. All right. That's less than 250 quarter-million transactions. That's like the equivalent of maybe the number of transactions in the Denver metropolitan area in a single day, let alone the whole world. All right? So now why does it matter? Because based on the information that I just saw, and it does fluctuate, the current estimated amount of electricity that's consumed to be able to solve only these transactions about every 15 minutes for about less than a quarter-million transactions in a day is 1.38.3 terawatt hours. All right? 1.38.3 terawatt hours. Why does that matter? Well, based on what Cambridge says, is that if the blockchain and this is just for Bitcoin, this doesn't include everything else. The Bitcoin engine would be that consumes the equivalent of the 27th greatest country, right? It's more electricity than is consumed by Sweden, for God's sakes. I said Denmark the other day. I'm sorry, I was wrong. That's too small. It's actually more electricity than completed by Sweden. And what happens is that as you add more computing power to the array that actually solves this, the network that solves this equation, right? Then the algorithm is designed to increase the number of zeros required to solve the problem. So the more computing power you add, the more electricity you use, and the longer it takes to solve the problem. By orders of magnitude, because every time you add a zero to the number, it's an order of magnitude more effort to be able to solve the problem. Do you understand the problem with this? Every time it adds a zero, you can start, it's an order of magnitude more electricity and more power required to solve the problem. All right? So, give you an example so that you can compare how much 138.3 terawatt hours is this country of Scotland. All right? Scotland only uses 25 terawatt hours a year. 25! Okay? So that gives you an idea of why it's a really bad idea from, they're talking about the greens. My video yesterday, all these people want to be so green and we think we're going to go to digital currency. Well, not with this, you're not. Because you couldn't have enough electricity on the planet and you wouldn't have enough computing power on the planet to be able to solve this. Because the more you add electricity and computing power to solve the problem, the harder the problem gets to be able to solve. It's like adding energy to accumulate to the speed of light. The faster you go, mass cubes to the square of velocity, right? So if you square your velocity, you've cubed your mass, and it takes you all that much more electricity to get to that next level, or more energy to be able to get to that next level, right? So there's that first part, and these are the actual discrete parts, but I'll use a graphic of how all of this works internally, so that you have a better understanding and how the clock face mechanics works. So there's that part, and then I'll be back for the second part. Okay, the whiteboard is at an angle, the camera I should say is at an angle so that you can see the whiteboard, which you'd think I would have done that to begin with, and my lights are going to probably reflect off of it, but it's going to be it's better the way it is than what it was. Alright? What the hell? So let me explain to you how this works. There are videos on how this works, but it's just easier for me to do it so that you can understand how it works. What happens is that this math works on the fact that A times B is the same as B times A. Now, elliptic curve cryptography doesn't use multiplication in a normal sense, right? What happens is that the algorithm, the equation for the elliptic curve cryptography that's used upon which Bitcoin and everything else is based, they use what's called a generator pair. We'll just call that G, all right? Everybody calls it G. It's a big generator pair, right? So there's like some X, comma Y, and these are very large numbers, and they're specifically chosen, right? Won't go into all of that. But there's G, right? And that's called the generator. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw, you remember those points earlier on? Well, it makes it easier to just kind of draw what looks like an elliptic curve. And they're discrete points on here, and I showed you before where those discrete points are based on the equation that I had chosen, right? So let's say that this happens to be the generator point right here, okay, the little generator point. And then what happens is there's what's called point addition and point multiplication, when in fact you're not doing either. For those of you that have taken calculus, what happens is that if you have one point and you take the slope to that curve, it'll intersect the curve at another point. All right, so this one point, because you're actually taking the slope on the curve, is called P1, P2 equals P3. So that point right there, it's only one point, but you're in essence multiplying it by itself. Okay? That's what you're doing. You're actually multiplying it by itself. And this over here is point P3. Okay? And that would be one step. Well, it's almost one step. Because then what you're supposed to do is, let's say, I don't remember what those numbers were, but let's say this is 7, 6. Right? Now what you're supposed to do is you take the reflex of that point, the negative of that brings the point down to here. Right? But there are no negative numbers in modular mathematics. So what's the real point? Well, what you would do is you would take -6 mod 13, and whatever that number is would actually be the y coordinate. These come in pairs. These come in pairs. All right? So if you want to find the reflected point from here to here, you take the y position, you make it a negative number, and then you run the modulo against it, and it'll give you the correct positive reflex point. So that's point multiplication, all right? But now now you're down here. We'll just call that R1, right? Now you want to add 2 points together, right? Well, if you want it, you would take this like this. That gives you 2 points, and there is P4. Okay? But then you would take the reflection of that, and that's actually the number you start with. So then let's say you need to sit down and you need to just take the slope to the curve. Well, you take the slope to the curve, and there's P5. Okay? So if you've got a number of ones and zeros, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, right? What you're able to do is you say, well, this is +1 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 2 +1 multiplied by 2 +1 multiplied by 2, and you can sit down and you cycle through all of this. So what happens is that you would pick a very large, you don't do it manually, the software does it for you, a very large number that becomes your private key. And that large private key, 7, 6, 5, 5, 2, 3, 1, and it goes on and on and on and on, is broken down into ones and zeros, which then the algorithm then adds and multiplies across this, it's point addition and point multiplication, and it loops through this thing that many number of times. Right? And it doesn't take that long. It's very fast. There's no more than 255, or I guess it's 512. 512 steps required for a 256-bit number. 256-bit number would take no more than 512 minus 1 steps to be able to go through this loop. Why is that important? Because that you end up, and this curve is massive. Mathematically, it's massive. You end up with an XY coordinate where the X coordinate on this thing is 255 bits. And there's no way to reverse this process. There's no way to be able to tell. It's called a one-way, it's a trapdoor function. There's no way, if you're given that XY coordinate of the point, because you only need the X, because of the way the math works out, because for every X there's only one Y position, right? So if you're X here, well, there's two Y positions, but they're the same thing. Because that if you try to reflect from here to here, you get infinity, right? So they're all the same thing. So anyway, the point is the Y doesn't matter, it's the X that matters. And then what happens is that you've got this really long number, and that becomes your public key. Okay, so now you've got yourself a private key, and you've got your private key, and then you loop through this sucker, just a huge number of times, and then when you're done, your new X coordinate equals your public key. Okay, and you can give that public key to everybody under the planet. So then what happens is you get somebody else's public key, right? Let's say it's the government, or it's a bank, or it's, it doesn't matter who it is, right? Then what happens is that you know where you ended, and you have their public key. Then you're able to loop through this again, right? It's actually more complicated than that because of the way the private key works. You loop through it again, and that gives you a new number. Well, why is that important? Because when he's got your public key and you've got his public key, and he raises it to his private key, because that's actually what you're doing, your private key, then you end up with a shared key between you, right? And then you're able to use what's called RSA, or there are other algorithms. And when you have that shared key, which can't be calculated by anybody because of the way modulo mathematics works. Modulo mathematics, let me explain how that works. Can you see this over here? Okay, let's do it this way. All right. All right. Literally think of a clock face. This is 12 o'clock. This is 6 o'clock, right? There's 3 o'clock. There's 9 o'clock. So if I say, as an example, 7 plus 19, right? What is that? 7, 8, 14, 15, 16. That's 16. All right? Then you divide, you figure out how many times 12 goes into 16, and you take the remainder. And that would be, so if you're 16, mod 12 is 4. Right? So now you'd be down here before. So this is the same thing as looping through this curve over and over and over and over again. And it's the same thing as going around and round and round and round on the inside of a clock face. And so your answer is 4, but nobody can tell how many times you've circled around this sucker. It's just not possible to do. All right? You can't tell how many times. And so every time you cycle through this, it has an upper limit. Right? It's like 255 bits or 128 bits or whatever. It's a sandbox. So there's a finite cutoff point, and when the numbers get bigger than that finite they start over. And they sit down. That's what the modulo is all about. It starts over. So you end up over here but nobody knows how many times your private key had to loop around to be able to get to this get to this number. And so this process creates shared keys. Why is this important? Because this is how it is that you're able to keep track of how you're able to prove your address, your Bitcoin address is a public key. Your Bitcoin address, where all your money is stored, is a public key. And how is it that you're able to prove that it's your money? You've got the private key, and there's an algorithm that they use. They provide you a number. You sit down and run it through your private key, and that private key then spits out another number that they're able to independently verify with their information, and then they know that you're the owner of that public key address. And that's what keeps the accounting system straight. But the amount of electricity that's required to be able to do this stuff is very minimal. All right. So the public key encryption system that keeps track of who owns what, and the blockchain itself, from a data perspective, uses very little electricity, and it's no more difficult than just modern day accounting. But the problem is what do you do when you go to solve that equation? Those 19 zeros, well, that proof of work is what eats up all that electricity, right? So there's a really basic, and it's really basic because of the way you have to use Bezos. It's called Bezo. I had it on the other one. It's B-E-Z-E-O-I-T, Bezo. I have it written down. And you use this algorithm to be able to take what's called the multiplicative inverse of these numbers so that you're able to actually solve your next point, right? And that's actually, if you go A to B minus 1 equals 0, it has to equal 0 modulo whatever size number you have. And when you're multiplying and dividing by zeros, in other words, if you've got, when you do this, you end up with a 0 over 1. That can cause problems because you have to take the multiplicative inverse of that, and the math can be a real pain. I mean, it's simple math, but it's not as simple as it first appears. All right. So anyway, so that gives you a basic idea of how the elliptic curve cryptography works. And then why it's just a stupid idea, because once I said, like I said earlier, is that the more computing power you put behind the problem to solve the problem, the more electricity you use, and then the very nature of it to slow down the process, it adds more and more zeros. So there's not enough electricity on the planet. There's not enough computing power on the planet to be able, because you would end up having to solve this thing for 125 zeros. You know, it's ridiculous. It's absurd. It's orders of magnitude. It's like I said, it's mass cubed to the square of the velocity, and you end up with the more computing power you add, the more electricity you consume, and the more difficult the problem becomes to be able to solve the equation. So I'm out of frame, but you get the idea, and hopefully you have an understanding as to why it is that cryptocurrencies are batshit crazy. They're not green. They should be banned, not because I don't believe in liberty and freedom. I certainly do, and I believe in the free market. But this is insane. They use more electricity than the production of steel worldwide. I mean, this is, you know, we want to get rid of gas and oil, but then we turn around and we consume all this electricity for something that's patently absurd. This is the cryptocurrencies. Well, yes, some people are making money on it, but they also do in Ponzi schemes and fraud. It'll never work in the long term, and it's a great experiment. But now there may be other equations, there may be other solutions, but the way that the Bitcoin algorithm, the elliptic curve cryptography algorithm through Bitcoin is implemented, and that's substantially the same for most cryptocurrencies, it'll never work in the long run. And nation states are going to get hip to this because our people up in Congress are a bunch of dullars. These people don't know anything. They can barely do basic math. They're very uneducated up there because you people keep electing these morons into office. You don't ask them any hard questions. If you ask them hard questions, they would fold. Like a bad poker hand, they would fold. You know, you're taking a windy walk down a Long Beach to find a closed cafe is the way these people think. You know, it's a metaphor of the fact that these people are slow. All right, you're taking a windy walk taking a long walk down a windy beach, and you find yourself with a closed cafe. And that's exactly what happens if you actually... This is why the media, the legacy media, never asks any real questions. Well, how are you going to solve COVID. Well, well, COVID's not a real thing, but that's not the point. So anyway, well, there you go, and thank you for the time.